Welcome to this Religion Media Centre review of 2025, where we're looking at the stories about religion that have hit the headlines this last year. It was a year when hate crime rose, especially against Jews and Muslims, a year of new leadership for Catholics and Anglicans, new organisations in the UK for progressive Jews and British Muslims, and new beginnings for collaborative interfaith work. It was a year of continuing wars, conflict around the world, but also efforts towards peace and justice. Christian nationalism moved into sharper focus in the United States and Britain, while talk of a quiet revival, particularly among Gen Z, has been clung onto by churches while roles decline. We'll try to reflect all of this, and we have a number of speakers who will introduce as we move through the various issues. We're going to start with hate crime and the most recent story, the terrible killing of 16 Jewish people gathered together for Hanukkah celebrations at Bondi Beach in Australia. Joining us, we have Simon Rothstein from the Progressive Jewish Movement and Victoria Lasek from the Board of Deputies. Hello, thank you very much for joining us. So, Simon, can we start with you? We have heard of the feelings amongst British Jews as the news rolled out from Australia on the fear and anger amongst communities over here after the attack at Hanukkah. Can you tell us your own experience of those feelings, of the events that have taken place in the last couple of days, just to bring us right up to speed, and how the British Jewish community is responding to what happened there?
Obviously, everyone is shocked and heartbroken. It's been such a difficult time, obviously following on from what happened on Yom Kippur in Manchester. And just as a community was sort of getting back to normal life, Hanukkah celebrations, again, these are things that I think deeply affect Jewish people personally, because I was in synagogue on Yom Kippur. Exactly could have been me, it could have been my family. We all knew people in the Manchester synagogue. We've all got friends in Australia. One of my cousins was working in the shop, was very lucky to still be alive. And, you know, we all celebrate Hanukkah. It's meant to be a public demonstration of faith, and yet now it's a very scary time. I think, especially on a religion media centre, it's important to point out that all of us, myself, the rabbis, our clergy, have all received messages from people of all faiths and no faith. A lot of people on this call, I can see the names here of text people within our Jewish faith to let them know that they're thinking of us. It's just a very, very difficult time to be Jewish. It's really strange when I talk to people outside the community. I do a lot of, so my position is I'm the Director of Communications for the Movement for Progressive Judaism. I do a lot of media work.
There were various headlines this year when anti-Semitism spiked. One occasion was after the mob violence set at Glastonbury, and then another in May, where after Israel announced it was expanding its action in Gaza. What do we know? What do you understand to be the main reasons for the rise? Is it October the 7th? Because there are lots of statistics showing the rise of anti-Semitic incidents since then. Or is it rising right-wing rhetoric, or is it everything?
I mean, I think it's a mix of everything. I think Victoria from the Board of Deputies will probably be able to answer that question a bit better, because they track this sort of thing much better than I do. But just from an anecdotal sense, I think it's a mixture of everything. I mean, anti-Semitism is the world's oldest hatred. It's never gone away. There's always some excuse why people are trying to target Jews. So I don't think, you know, a Hanukkah celebration on Bondi Beach has got very little to do with anything that happened at Glastonbury or anything that's happening in Israel, etc. I think there's always Jews being targeted, but I think Victoria probably would answer that question a bit better than I can.
Thank you. Victoria, can I ask you, you're a member of the Board of Deputies, can I ask you particularly about the statistics as it relates to young people in school, challenges for students at universities? What has been your experience of anti-Semitism in 2025 from the people that you represent and work with?
So just for some background, I was the Secretariat for the Commission on Anti-Semitism, which the Board of Deputies ran this year together with Dame Penny Mordaunt and Lord John Mann. And as part of that, we had various different focus groups with people in the Jewish community. One of these focus groups was with presidents of university JSOCs, and the prevailing sentiment that we heard from Jewish students is a feeling of isolation on campus, if it's affecting Jewish students feeling an ability of being able to go onto campus safely, if there are slogans that are written on university grounds and signs and calls for death to Israel, that affects students personally, and it no longer is about an honest academic discussion about different viewpoints, but it's more experienced as incitement and an attempt to intimidate and scare Jewish students from being on campus.
Thank you very much. And a final question to you, Simon. This was the year when the Progressive Judaism movement was formed, an amalgamation of liberal Jews and Reform Jews. How significant a change has that been for Jews in Britain?
In amongst a very, very difficult year, or in fact, a very difficult 2 years for Jewish people in Britain, there's been lots of positives happening. On the part of the Jewish community where I come from, which is the progressive community, there has been a big movement, which is that the liberal Judaism and Reform Judaism have merged into one progressive Judaism, which, while maybe very niche within our Jewish community, has got lots of historical significance. It was the first merger of any two Jewish streams. I think the first merger of any religion in the UK since the 1970s. And I think it's going to be really important for Jews going forward in terms of now there's one body that represents all progressive Jews. So I won't go into it because I know it's short on time, but just the words progressive and orthodox probably show what each represents. And now about 30% of Jews are represented by progressive Judaism, 77 communities across the country. And it just means that the progressive voice will be louder, more visible, more opportunities for our members.
Thank you very much. We're going to turn now to British Muslims this year. And our guests are Dr. Azim Ahmed, General Secretary of the Muslim Council of Wales, and Akila Ahmed, CEO and founder of the British Muslim Trust. Can I start with the thorny question of the definition of Islamophobia? So in March, the government set up a group which was designed to create a new definition, and it still hasn't reported back. Akila, what's your understanding of the difficulties this group has faced and why there's been no resolution to it yet?
Yes, I'm a member of the working group. We were appointed in February/March of this year. Our term was for 6 months, which ended in October. We submitted advice to government on what a definition could look like. And now that advice is in government's hands. It's very much up to government about when they would like to make an announcement and what the next steps would be if they do want to adopt a definition.
Do you think it's going to happen?
I mean, I think that really is for government to answer. There's been lots of media interest over the last few days, and I think government have put out some, positive sounds on this definition. They've committed to the work, but really, ultimately, it's only government that can answer that question.
Okay, moving to you, Azim. You're the General Secretary of the Muslim Council of Wales. I want to talk to you about hate crime. We were just talking about it as it affects British Jews. But the British Muslim Trust, which Akila founded, has recorded an escalation in mosque attacks. And there were earlier stats from the Home Office saying that there'd been a 19% increase in religious hate crimes to the middle of this year. Tell us about the experience of Muslims in Wales, your experience of rising hate crime, what people are saying to you about how difficult it is to be a Muslim in Wales.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ruth. And, as you said, the statistics are very clear. There's a rise. And there's different elements to Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hatred, however you want to describe it. There's the element of on-street abuse. There's elements of targeting places of worship. Just as the Jewish community have been targeted. Very recently, we had a case in Cardiff, which involves an alleged plot to target both Muslim and Jewish site in this capital city. But there's also another element to it, which I think is the more harmful, which is around discrimination, especially in the job market. We still see in lots of different academic research that Muslims face some of the biggest penalties in the job market in terms of hiring. And this has a kind of long-term generational impact. So it's a very challenging time, both in terms of the fear on the streets, but also in terms of life opportunities and participation in society.
Akila, going back to you, we mentioned that you'd founded the British Muslim Trust. But also this year, there's been the Muslim Women's Network set up. Earlier, there was the British Muslim Network. I don't know if that's still going. Perhaps you could let us know. And there's a new Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain, all this change with the organisations. What impact have these changes made on the life of ordinary Muslims in Britain? Has anything changed at all, or is this just organisational?
So, as Abdul Azim mentioned, and as you rightly mentioned as well, British Muslims are definitely feeling that there's increasing hostility towards them. And this is in different aspects of their lives, from hate crime on the street to the targeting of mosques. At British Muslim Trust, we looked at the number of attacks on mosques from July 2025 to October 2025. And what we found was that there was 27 attacks against essentially 25 mosques in 23 different towns and cities around the country. That's unprecedented. I think over a 13-day period, there were 9 attacks on mosques. And within those findings, we found that there was increasing severity and frequency in the attacks, and there was a use of Christian symbols and slogans, and also the placement of our national flags, the Union Jack and the St. George's Cross, and that is also a step change. So I think in this context of increasing, and also the Home Office figures released earlier this year, found that in the last year, there's been an increase of 19% recorded hate crimes against British Muslims. And those are only the hate crimes that are recorded. There's a significant amount of underreporting, and that's why organisations like British Muslim Trust exist, so that people can report to us. So in the context of rising hostility and, the breakdown of cohesion and polarization, I think British Muslims are feeling like there is a need to really invest in their resilience and build infrastructure, communal infrastructure across the piece. There's around 4 million British Muslims in the UK. 1 or 2 organisations are not going to be able to meet the sort of needs of all of those British Muslims. And I think also part of the sort of setting up of different organisations or the change of personnel is really about British Muslims recognising that they really need to kind of reach out and build allies across society. And so a lot of the work that we do at British Muslim Trust is also about building partnerships, strategic partnerships with organisations that are working in similar spaces to us, and so that we can all stand collectively against hatred.
Moving back to Azim, this year was a big year for you because it was the 20th anniversary of the Islam UK Centre at Cardiff University. And you held a conference where you talked about the state of the academic study of Islam in Britain in the various universities around the country. What's your reflection on academic study into Islam? Is it a growth area? Is there a renewed interest in it? Are you safe for the next 20 years?
I think it's an interesting opportunity to kind of look backwards in terms of, I think, the last 20 years, both in terms of academic study of religion, academic study of Islam and Muslim communities. It's an optimistic story. It's positive. There's growth. There's establishment. There's lots of local initiatives. I think the challenge is, much like the challenge facing religion more broadly, is while there's lots of discussion around religion, especially in the media, especially in politics, that's not always informed by a degree of religious literacy and knowledge. And what we are seeing both at, secondary school level right the way through to higher education is that pipeline of specialism is very much diminishing. So Cardiff University, where I'm based, is no longer offering a religious degree in the long-term plans. And that's a story you'll find across the UK. So given the kind of circumstances facing society, a more diverse religious population, a need for more religiously informed decision-making and policy-making, it feels like the wrong time to actually recede that level of education. So it's a bit of a mixed bag in that sense.
Thank you. So we'll talk about religious education now. We're joined by Sarah Lane Court, chair of the Religious Education Council. And it was a big year for religious education this year because finally religious education was now put on the national curriculum. And this was an announcement that was responded to with great joy by RE teachers. They finally felt that their subject was being taken seriously. How significant was that move, do you think?
Well, Ruth, I think we better not celebrate prematurely. And there are some people still who have reservations about that. We don't actually have a guarantee that RE will go into the national curriculum. The commission, curriculum and Assessment Review, sorry, I'm getting muddled up with my initials here, recommended that RE should move towards the national curriculum, but it depends on the sector reaching a consensus. Now, when you have a really diverse sector, and the RE Council itself has 60 different organisations in membership, I always say we've got the A to Z of religions and beliefs, as well as academic organisations, the Religion Media Centre, grant-making trusts, and all sorts of others. Actually reaching a consensus is not something that will happen overnight, but we only have until the end of March. If we can reach a consensus on what should go into a national curriculum, how it should look, then the Secretary of State will set up a consultation about the content. So it's a process. It's the beginning of a journey rather than the end point. And yes, some people are really excited about it. And the really great thing about it is it recognises the subject's important. I think we need good religious education in order to navigate any of the stories that we're talking about today.
What has happened this year when it comes to the recruitment of teachers? There was a shortage at the beginning of the year, and then the government ended the bursary for people going forward to train to teach religious education. What's the state of the situation now? Are there enough?
No, there aren't enough. The subject has under-recruited for 12 of the last 13 years. If you go into a secondary school, across the Board of Secondary Schools, we find that 51% of teachers teaching religious education are spending most of their time teaching another subject. That wouldn't happen in English or maths or even history or geography. So those teachers most likely have not got much by way of qualifications in religious education. They might be really passionate about it, they might really enjoy it, but some of them are just being used to fill the timetable. So young people are being shortchanged by not having access to highly qualified and well-trained teachers. The removal of the bursary makes that worse. We know that having a bursary of £10,000 to assist those who wanted to train to teach last year boosted recruitment. We see a drop this year, quite a significant drop. And that has been the pattern. Whenever there's been a bursary, we've had a boost. It does encourage people who are taking on teaching as a second career, perhaps people who have families who are a bit older. It makes it more possible for them. It also encourages a more diverse population to teach RE. And removing it is really problematic. And we see other subjects still have bursaries and some have scholarships as well. If you want to train to teach some of the sciences, you can get a bursary of £29,000 plus a scholarship. If you want to teach religious education, which I would argue, and I think others would as well, is more important now than ever, you get nothing. In fact, you've got to pay for the privilege.
Thanks very much. We want to do another faith tradition in Britain, and that's Hinduism. And we should have Tilak Parakh on the line, PhD student in the Faculty of Divinity at Cambridge University. Hi, Tilak. Thanks for joining. You had a starring role, of course, this year in the BBC documentary about the Kumbh Mela, this enormous festival in India. I was just looking it up, and it said that 660 million people attended this festival. And it was a fantastic documentary with Amal Rajan, the BBC presenter. How important was it that that kind of programme is made about Hinduism for the community, the Hindu community in the UK?
I think as the Hindu community grows in the UK, such programs, of course, increase education. And I mean, so as we've been hearing from the other commentators, education is, of course, an incredibly important need at the moment, especially in the climate we're in, simply understanding each other's faiths. And what documentaries like that do, I think, is they probe beyond the headlines and they humanize such events. And they also provide deeper meaning in terms of to understand the complexities, the meanings, the theologies and the beliefs behind some of the spectacles and some behind the headlines at times, which provide greater understanding to the public in general, to what Hindus believe, how they celebrate their faith.
Another way that you got into the news yourself this year was with the visit by the King and the Queen to Neasden Temple in October, which was celebrating its 30th anniversary. That was a high point, I'm sure, in the life of the temple, but also significant that the King was there.
Yep, I mean, the Neasden Temple has become a significant landmark in the religious landscape of the UK, especially for Hindus as well. And I think the King's had a long-standing relationship with many faiths. We saw George when he was coronated. I mean, he mentioned how he's there to support faiths. And him coming to the temple, he visited his prince several times. And him arriving, I think, was a very significant moment for Hindus and for the congregation at the Neasden Temple, especially because, I mean, in many ways it signified a moment of being recognized. When the monarch himself arrives, it was a moment of recognition and of dialogue. The head of the Anglican Church coming to a Hindu temple was a significant moment of dialogue for everyone there as well.
Thank you. Well, we're going to pick that idea up of dialogue now with Rebecca Collins, the Programme and Development Manager at the Faith and Belief Forum. And Rebecca, your particular organisation has been very active this year in moves towards regrouping after the Interfaith network was it folded because the Tory government didn't give it a tranche of money that had been expected. And the way that I saw it, listening to what people were saying, was that people were casting around looking for something similar to take its place. What has happened this year? How developed are the moves now to recreate something like the Interfaith network?
It has been a really busy year in the interfaith world. And I think after, as you said, the Interfaith Network closed in 2024, there was definitely a regrouping in the sector and a renewed commitment to ensure that the interfaith work does continue. We're seeing it as increasingly important and an essential part of bringing faiths together across the UK. So in January this year, the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government funded a consultation that was led by the Faith and Belief Forum, which enabled us to go out across the regions of the UK and engage with interfaith and faith organisations and talk to them about what's needed for the future of interfaith work. And out of that, we, with URI, produced a report called Bursting the Bubble, where we brought together all of our findings from that consultation about what the future of interfaith could be. And we had a fantastic launch in May of this year, launched in Parliament, and we had a lot of engagement with that. And then increasingly, we then got extra funding from MHCLG to continue to do that work, to bring some of those recommendations around bursting the bubble to Interfaith 2025.
And that was the government department gave you some money to do that. I was going to ask you about your relationship with the faith minister and the department. We've had a new faith minister this year as well as all the other changes. How successful has that role change been? And are you getting sufficient backing from the government department?
Lord Khan, the faith minister who was reshuffled in September, was an incredibly strong backer of interfaith work, and we saw him very much as going out and speaking to those faith groups and interfaith organisations about their experiences, really supporting them, attending events, and being really proactive. So we were concerned in the reshuffle that before there has been a 15-month gap when that role was vacant of the minister in charge of faith or interfaith work. So we were concerned that maybe that faith element would get lost. But we were delighted to see that Miatta Farnbula MP was appointed a Minister for Devolution, Faith and Communities a little bit later. And so far, we've had fantastic engagement from her. She actually spoke at our Interfaith Week launch in November. And we've had she's been really supportive. And the government department have been supportive in looking forward to thinking how we can continue to do interfaith work in the UK.
In a nutshell, how would you describe the challenges of interfaith collaboration at the end of 2025?
we've heard from the different speakers about the challenges that different faiths and groups are feeling at the moment. And inevitably, when faiths feel attacked or faiths are attacked, that influences their engagement with others. We have experienced some groups maybe withdrawing from interfaith engagement, which I think is understandable. People are feeling, who can we trust? Are we really supported? Are there groups out there who are supporting us? And I think that's been particularly relevant with the rise of far right. There's been lots of protests and demonstrations this year. There's been flags put up. There are lots of issues around race and faith of people feeling attacked. Even if faith groups aren't feeling attacked directly, there's this feeling of unease and unbelonging that's sort of emerging in the country. And people are looking and thinking, will their group be the next to be targeted? So obviously the horrific attacks at Heaton Park Synagogue have shown that there are real fears around being a person of faith in the UK. And so although we have seen these particular tensions and conflicts play out, we've also seen the ways in which people are reaching across divides to support each other in those terrible times. We've seen incredible interfaith support and allyship, really saying, we're here with you, we stand with you. So I think despite this difficult situation we're in the UK, we have seen that interfaith strength really coming through this year as well.
Thank you. We're going to go to America now. And it's great that we've been joined, because it's very early in the morning in the States, but we've been joined by Melissa Deckman, CEO of the Public Religion Research Institute, and Bob Smith, a national reporter for the Religion News Service. It's good to see you again. I know you've contributed to us a lot over the past few years. We're very interested in what happens in the States over here, particularly what's happening in the world of religion. Bob, I'm going to start with you. The Religion News Service has followed very closely the protests by the different Christian denominations against the ICE raids as migrants are rounded up and deported. Can you tell us something more about the extent of these protests? How perhaps it's taken people by surprise that this has been so widespread across America, or how you judge what's going on?
It's hard to tell because it depends where you are. So I live outside Chicago. We've had a lot here. So I have had, we've had protests in neighborhoods outside of churches. We've had, I have a friend whose daughter had a gun pointed at her. This is a young woman who's a mom. So there's these real civilian sort of protests. I think a couple places have been, I think here's a place that shows kind of the tensions around this issue. There's a church in Evanston, Illinois, that put up a nativity where the baby Jesus was in zip ties, and it says ICE was here. And then somebody last night came in and smashed it and decapitated the Mary statue. So they put it back up. So there's a real there's real concern about this. I think even in local congregations. Even the congregation I go to has a Spanish-speaking service. Nobody comes to it because of fear that there might be raids. So it's just some of it is in public and some of it is under the radar.
Melissa, can I ask you what work the Public Religion Research Institute has done around this, and what have you found about the extent of the protests?
We haven't really asked about attitudes on the protest per se, but we do have a lot of analysis on how religion impacts Americans' views on immigration. In fact, we just released a report last week. And what we find is that most people of faith are really opposed to the crackdown that you're seeing with the Trump administration on a variety of levels here. And so I think, and building on a lot of the good work that RNS has done with Bob and Jack Jenkins and others, we're finding that there is, I think, a clear moral religious voice and a majority of Americans who are opposing what we're seeing. That said, I think that these severe crackdowns that you're seeing in the Trump administration, those policies are popular with some religious Americans, particularly those Americans we describe as subscribing to Christian nationalist views. And a lot of white evangelical Protestants are broadly supportive of these measures. So I think looking at the religious picture is complex, but I would just say that most people of faith are not at all happy with what's happening right now with respect to immigration policy.
We were watching the news reports of the death of Charlie Kirk and the subsequent rally that was held, and the vast support there seemed to be for Christian nationalism in the States. Going to you first of all on this, Bob. When Charlie Kirk died, were people in the pew aware of the enormous significance that he had to most Americans, or did the extent of his following take you by surprise?
So I think that Charlie Kirk is a great example of how divided we are in America. There are people who knew him and adored him and knew him as a kind of role model for young people. And he had become much more outspoken about his faith in recent years, even talking about taking Sabbaths, and had become this kind of ideal role model, especially for younger, more conservative college students or older pastors who saw him as kind of an outspoken young person. And then there are a whole bunch of people who saw him as a podcaster who said provocative things and sometimes very cruel things. So it's really a kind of, I don't know what the right word, but if you mirror to see what you want to see. So in America, we have people who thought we had people getting fired for posting how much they were pleased that he'd been killed. And then people, mourning him. And so even that's his funeral, that was a big megachurch funeral. And I think half the country were like, oh, this looks familiar. People who go to big megachurches have seen that. And then half the people are like, oh my God, what is this thing? So we're really divided on how we see things and people in America live in different kinds of worlds and how we, if you're conservative or progressive.
Melissa, one difference that we've seen is that over here we had a Unite the Kingdom rally, which was Christian nationalist rally, and the several bishops and church leaders came out in protest and said that this was misuse of Christian symbols in the rally. Over there, has there been any widespread comment from establishment church leaders about the rise of Christian nationalism? How is it playing out in America?
So we routinely ask at PRI about, Americans, their views that we would consider Christian nationalist in nature. And we find that about 1 in 10 Americans are really adherents of Christian nationalism, whereas an additional 2 in 10 are maybe sympathetic to those views. That number really hasn't changed over the last 3 years. We're doing these very systematic surveys of the American public. And so it's really a minority viewpoint in the United States. But I think what's notable about Christian nationalism is in wake of Trump's election, the views of Christian nationalism you see really spread through a lot of people within the administration and a lot of the policies that you're seeing. So I do think too, so this is not necessarily a view that's endorsed by a majority of Americans, but you're seeing in the Trump administration, whether it is with respect to rolling back LGBTQ rights, really looking at higher education and sort of the cultural attacks on higher education, to a wide variety of other things, including immigration. I think it's very popular, this immigration crackdown with Christian nationalist Americans. But really, I think the religious, expression in the U.S., there's more diversity, and there are a lot of, I think, churches, people of faith of different denominations who are coming together and saying, look, there's actually another alternative narrative when it comes to Christianity. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind, that certainly Christian nationalism isn't growing in the U.S., but I think it's impacted to more pronounced with this current administration. But again, it's not a viewpoint that I think most people of faith, and certainly not religiously unaffiliated Americans, endorse.
Yeah, I think it's a real hard thing to measure too. As Melissa said, there's a very small people who adhere to the ideas of Christian nationalism, that America only belongs Christian. There are a lot of religious people in America who are very patriotic, and there's a lot of religious language. So it has it taps into this kind of broader discussion we're having over what's the role of religion in public life, what is the role what does Christianity look like in America when we move from a country where it was almost totally Christian to a country that's going to be much more pluralistic, and that's a really rocky road. And so folks who so there's arguments over the word Christian nationalism itself because it's used. Melissa and PRI do it in a very careful and concise way. Other folks use the word profligately, and it's harder to talk about because we don't know what we're talking about.
Right, thank you. I'm just going to give you one last question, Bob, very, very briefly. You said to me you wanted to end on an upbeat, that there's much talk of the decline of religion, but you've seen a sign of growth.
Well, not growth, but pause. There's a kind of leveling off and the decline, which makes it really interesting. We don't know. There was a leveling off in some of the survey data about 20 years ago. And so we don't know like how long this will last. There's all these Bibles. There's a lot of religious activity, and it's a great time to be a religion reporter because we don't know what's going on. Even this pause has taken some time to recognize, so we don't know. So there are people saying there's a revival, and the data says no. But the data doesn't say the decline is paused, but it may be in the future. So we're in this a kind of cusp of what is going on. So it's a great time to be a religion reporter. But it is nice to not say, because we wrote the decline story every year for every year, and now it's like, oh, it's not declining, but it will in the future, but we don't know when, and we don't know what's going on. So it's kind of fun.
Right. Great. What's the story? Great. Thanks so much, Bob and Melissa, for joining us from the States. The Catholic Church. Pope Francis died. There's a new pope, and that was perhaps the most startling headline of the year. But we're joined by Ruth Gledhill, assistant editor at The Tablet, and Sister Gemma Simmons, senior fellow and director of the Religious Life Institute in Cambridge. Thank you both for joining us. Ruth, first of all, obviously the death of Pope Francis and his legacy was a key point. And the election of Pope Leo. How do you assess how Pope Leo has started in his years of office?
Well, his first words from the balcony when he was elected in May were "Peace be with you." And his period in office so far has been expressive of those sentiments, really. It's been less kind of in your face than Pope Francis was, a different style of papacy, nevertheless continuing with the legacy of Pope Francis, particularly in areas such as world peace and the environment. And what's extraordinary about Pope Leo is what a likeable man he is and how relatable. And of course, he's the first English-speaking pope that we've had. Well, English is his natural language his native language for centuries, since Shakespeare, really, the last English pope. And I think that does make a difference to certainly how he relates to people in the West and how the West relates to him.
And Gemma, have you actually met Pope Leo? Were you over there in Rome while all this was going on for any reason?
I wasn't. I did, I think, 25 radio and TV interviews at the time, both of the death of Pope Francis and the accession of Pope Leo, but I did them from home. But what fascinated me was the level of interest, of global interest, by some very, very serious media players who really saw this as a potential pivotal moment in a world where religion is both playing a far more prominent role in all sorts of areas of public life, as we've seen. But at the same time, there has been a very sharp decline in people's religious literacy, which we've also heard about. So I was fascinated by how interested the kind of big dogs in the media were as to what was going on.
Almost immediately, we had the decision that there was going to be no change. Women could not be deacons. How did that go down with you, Gemma?
I was massively disappointed, though not surprised. I've been disappointed by the whole process. I mean, the first commission that was appointed by Pope Francis of extremely prominent and well-educated theologians decided that there was no historical or theological reason why women could not again be ordained deacons as they historically were in the Catholic Church. They gave that as their decision, and to my great sadness, Pope Francis disbanded that commission and put another one in its place. And if you look at the people and the kind of views they represent, I'm not surprised that this is the end that we've come to. I still don't think it is dead. This is not a question that's going to go away. Catholic women and many Catholic men are not going to allow this to go away. We just have to remember we're in for the long haul.
And we were talking about the number of Catholic clergy, Anglican clergy, who've left the Anglican Church in opposition to the ordination of women, and they've joined the Catholic Church. So that was another interesting statistic that we saw this year.
It is, but if I may say that what we don't get is the statistics that I see in my relations with the Anglican Church of the number of Catholic women that have left the Catholic Church to become Anglican priests. I would be very interested to put both those set of statistics together. So far, I've not found anyone who's done that.
Sounds like a job for you, Tim, I think, when we come to you. The other thing that the headline this year is, of course, Cardinal Nichols turned 80. And Ruth, can I just ask you, everyone was expecting him to retire almost as soon as his birthday cake, the candles have been blown, and nothing's happened. He's still there. What's going on?
Well, we don't have his successor yet. And while a number of people are in the frame, such as Archbishop Wilson of Southwark, Marcus Stock of Leeds, Archbishop Wanley of Birmingham, and as recently as last week, people were talking about Richard Moss of Arundel and Brighton. Nothing has been announced yet. So we are kind of expecting an announcement any day now, but this actually might be a story that we're reviewing at the end of 2026 if the current situation continues much longer.
I mean, to carry on in your 80th year, I know it's obedience, but it just seemed to me to be stretching it a bit. But can I ask you, Ruth, as you look back on 2025, because you're there at the helm of the tablet, reporting on Catholics in the UK, what has leapt out to you as the headlines of where the Catholic Church is in Britain at the moment?
I think what Gemma was talking about, the disappointing decision on women deacons, was significant, although the report did use this phrase, not at this time, which people are interpreting as maybe there still being a chink in the door that might lead it to open at some time in the not too distant future. Then there has also been this talk of this quiet revival and whether people becoming Catholic, in a reversal that we were hearing about earlier of the trends of decline. And in fact, I was talking to a priest at a party, actually the Prime Minister's Advent reception at Downing Street the other day, and there's a Catholic priest there, and he was saying what was really interesting was that, yes, he's seen a revival, and where this revival is in the more Catholic wing, not necessarily the traditional side, but not the liberal churches. He was saying it's the churches that embrace tradition and solid doctrine, not Latin Mass churches so much as just churches that are really quite down the line in terms of being traditional liturgy, in terms of the current accepted forms of the liturgy. And so what he was saying was that people want form and stability and want orthodoxy. And I found that really, really fascinating.
Thank you. Gemma, I know you have to go, but one final question to you. The place of the Catholic Church in society and the pronouncements that have been made about various moral issues, especially about assisted dying. Do you look back with some gratitude or hope that these messages have been given by the Church and that at least it has said something?
I certainly think that on things like assisted dying and abortion up to the moment of birth, the Catholic Church has shown the same kind of leadership it's always shown. And it's been fascinating to see how many people who are not Catholic, not Christian, have really joined in a protest about this sort of legislation that is being rushed through Parliament with very little scrutiny. What I find, however, is that on the issue of Christian nationalism and the harnessing, the hijacking of Christianity, Christian symbols, and Christian speech by people who are peddling something that is absolutely the antithesis of Christianity, I find the silence of the Catholic bishops absolutely deafening and completely incomprehensible. I mean, churches together in England and Wales, to which I belong, and the Anglican bishops have managed to say something united about, look, guys, this is not Christianity. Please do not be fooled by this kind of rhetoric. The Catholic Church's silence in this country on such a topic has been howling, and I don't understand it. We've got some excellent bishops And I wish they had the courage to speak, because people need to hear this before it's too late.
Thank you, Gemma, and thank you, Ruth. And we're going to turn to the Church of England now with Tim Wyatt, a freelance religion reporter, and the Reverend Alex Frost, the Vicar of St Matthew the Apostle in Burnley. Tim, listening to what Gemma had to say there, I don't know if you want to pick up that theme, that Gemma was concerned that not enough was coming from the Catholic bishops about Unite the Kingdom and the rise of Christian nationalism. But there have been pronouncements from Anglican bishops. Do you see this development as being one of the key headlines of the life of the church in Britain in 2025?
Yeah, I think it has, certainly in the last kind of quarter, a third of the year, been one of the major stories, dating back to that first Tommy Robinson rally, Unite the Kingdom, in September, where people were kind of shocked to see hundreds of thousands of British people flock into central London for what was ostensibly a kind of far-right anti-immigration protest, but also the kind of overwhelmingly Christian flavour of that, shouts of Christ is King and people waving crucifixes in the air, and then a panoply of slightly oddball, eccentric bishops and clergy on the stage. And that caught, I think, the church on the hop, caught people by surprise. People thought that kind of stuff happens in America, but it doesn't happen here. And so there's been months of kind of agonising about what is Christian nationalism and why are people taking the faith in this way, and are they co-opting the cross? And so when this carol service that just happened on Saturday, there was a massive kind of preemptive backlash from a lot of the mainstream church, in particular some bishops in the Church of England. Aaron Aurora, the Bishop of Kirkstall in the Diocese of Leeds, has been kind of most prominent on this, as well as others kind of quite aggressively saying this is not what our Christianity is about. Jesus was a refugee. And the message of Christmas is one of welcome to all and good news for all. It's not about exclusion. Then, of course, the kind of counter argument comes from Tommy Robinson and his allies that this is just about putting Christ back in Christmas. Who could be against that? They're the only ones brave enough to kind of speak up for Britain's Christian heritage. So I certainly think this is going to be an argument between Christians and between the kind of mainstream church and some of the fringier folk associated with that movement over the rest of 2026.
What do you think the headline has been for the Church of England?
Well, I mean, it's hard to look beyond a new Archbishop of Canterbury, is it? That was a really significant moment in October when Sarah Mullally was unveiled as the successor to Justin Welby, the first woman to ever take on that role in 1,500 years. And she's got herself got a really interesting background, a nurse by training. She rose up to become the chief nurse for the whole of England in the NHS, just in her 30s, and then kind of abandoned the glittering heights of that civil service career to step back and be a vicar, and has now risen to the top of a second profession. Although I know that she would say she sees it as a kind of single vocation, and that she has been kind of following the call of God in her life to serve in different ways over the whole of her career.
Alex, thank you very much for joining us. You've been a member of the General Synod and seen the arguments within the church up close. Were you relieved when Sarah Mullally was finally announced as the next Archbishop? How did it go down with you and your congregation?
Well, I think there's kind of two parallel universes at play here, Ruth. I think there's the reality of the national church and the great institution. And so I think there's moderate interest in the provinces around who the next Archbishop is. I think it's great for the church that this is a female, and I think this is progressive and what lots of people want to see. I think there's a truth to be said that in many churches, they just get on with the normality. And I think it's interesting, the point you made before about Tommy Robinson and what's going on. And I think the churches need to be confident to speak out. We shouldn't wait for bishops to speak for us. I think we should be brave and bold enough to show people what is actually going on in places of worship. So my church, for example, has become beautifully diverse. It's extremely multicultural, where we have people from across the globe, from America, from Hong Kong, from Estonia, Poland, and the beautiful fruitfulness that brings to a parish and a congregation is a story that needs to be told. And I haven't heard that being told by bishops. And I think it says something about the malaise about the place we are in as a church, and a kind of a lethargy about us that we really need people. We need to be on the front foot. We shouldn't be waiting for responses. We shouldn't be waiting for something to happen for us to make our feelings felt. And I think it's really important as we're going to the new year that we're at the front of the curb, curve, and we're not somewhere in the middle waiting for things to happen and then we kind of shove our two penneth in. I think it's important that the church is confident to proclaim what we're here to talk about, which is that Jesus is the light of the world and we're going to shine in the darkness. And that is difficult for us as an institution because of the historical stuff that we're faced with. But for many people living in that parallel world of church, that's the reality of what we're trying to do.
And one of the other major stories for the Church of England over the last year has obviously been a kind of the rolling safeguarding crisis that I guess began in 2024 when the Macon report came out and kind of forced Justin Welby to resign. But there was been a slew of stories about bishops and clergy, some historic, some more recent, caught up in abuse scandals, accusations flying around. Do you feel that, does that filter down to the parish level? Does that impede your ability as a parish priest to do mission? People see the dog collar and they immediately get fearful. Is that a reality for you at all?
The reality for me, Tim, is that I come from a place of management. I worked for Argos for 20 years where I had to do what I was told. And some of those things I had to do, doing what I was told, was what we called the non-negotiables. And safeguarding, I think, is a non-negotiable, whether it's at the highest level or whether it's somewhere in the centre, or if it's in a parish where there's 20 or 30 people worshipping. And I think people have got to understand they've got certain responsibilities, and I take my responses very seriously. But I would caveat that by saying, I am a parish priest, and I do ensure that everybody in my church who has a responsibility around safeguarding has done the legal stuff and the non-negotiables. But I'm not an expert, so I've always called for external safeguarding ownership. I've always called for a third party so that if a problem is presented to me, I can use the knowledge that I have, but I can signpost it to an expert. And I think that's really important. I think it's really important for the future prosperity of our church that bishops are not being held accountable for everything that might go wrong in their diocese, because that's not a reality. That's impossible. But it is plausible to say to the diocesan bishop, have you sent it to the right people who can deal with it and will resolve the issue, who are professionals where it is their absolute area of expertise? To me, I just don't understand why we've not done that. We've missed an opportunity until we nail these things. We've just seen the recent documentary around Smythe. My goodness me, we need to be much, much better.
I guess just passing back to you, Ruth, one of the major other things that came out of the Church of England world was there was a vote in February at the General Synod, the governing body, to outsource safeguarding for the first time, which is quite a major step. It hasn't happened yet, but the kind of principle has been approved by the Synod that the bishop shouldn't be marking their own homework, that there should be a new independent arm's length charity that oversees safeguarding the Church of England. The kind of arguments will roll on for years about how exactly that works and how do you move over the existing safeguarding officers and where does the money come from. There's a lot of detail to be worked out, but I think watching that over 26 will be a significant story as well.
There was another thing that happened at the February Synod that you want to draw attention to, Alex. What happened then?
Well, yeah, I do want to talk about working class vocations, not for any kind of self-promotion, but for the absolute need that the church becomes a broader church. And so in February, I presented a private member's motion about a strategy for working class vocations in the church and in my context, working on an urban estate, I see rich talent that is just not being kind of excavated really, and I think that's replicated across the country. So I have called for a national strategy, and with good news in mind, I'm really pleased that there's been a group of people, including myself, been working on that strategy, and hopefully in February 26 we will come back and share more of what that's going to look like. But I've been so encouraged by working class people who've been in touch with me and said, well, just thank you for giving us a voice. It's long overdue. The church needs much, 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 much wider representation, where it becomes a place where we don't feel we're being talked down to by the middle and upper classes, that we are actually part of the same congregation, and maybe they might even look up to us for insight and inspiration. So, yeah, thank you.
One final question for you, Tim and Alex, which is that this quiet revolution that there was a great fanfare about earlier in the year, especially amongst young people. Is it boycotting or sidestepping the Church of England? Question to you, Alex.
Not in my church. We just took a group of about 20 kids on trips to Blackpool to meet some of our neighbours down the road and what life's like for them in urban Blackpool. But I think we mustn't kind of jump on a bandwagon and say everything's wonderful and flourishing, because it ain't, and I think there's a lot of work to do. But I do think, speaking to these people, they've got questions about faith. They've got a spiritual side to them. They want to ask questions. And I think for me, it's really important we educate them and nurture them rather than indoctrinate them and tell them what they must think and how they must be going about their Christian ministry.
Tim, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, the Quiet Revival was this report from the Bible Society that came out in about April time, and it had this astonishing claim from a YouGov survey that church-going in the UK in England, in Wales, had exploded, 56% increase in just 6 years from 2018 to 2024, which was absolutely unprecedented and extraordinary in the wake of kind of decades of generational decline in church-going. So it's really energized Christians, I think, across denominations, not just the Church of England. It's really kicked up a fuss. I have to say, having been talking to a lot of statisticians and sociologists, it is very much an anomalous result that absolutely is not replicated in, for example, the Church of England's own very detailed and thorough statistics that it counts. It's seeing kind of small 1-2% growth, which in itself is cause for celebration, but no one has yet been able to kind of substantiate the Bible Society's more exciting claims about kind of rocketing 50% plus growth, particularly among young people. So there'll be more arguing about that across next year, I'm sure, as new surveys come in and new attempts to kind of quantify this. But anecdotally, I hear lots of stories like Alex shares of a kind of renewed openness to faith, and we'll see if that continues.
Thank you. So we have two more guests before we finish our review of the year. Importantly, we're turning to Simeon Mitchell next, the team leader of the Joint Public Issues team, which is a joint organisation representing Baptists, Methodists, the URC and the Church of England. Simeon, thank you for joining us. We've looked at the Catholics, we've looked at the Church of England. Tell us something about how you draw the denominations together and the work that you've completed this year together on the front line of social action in the UK.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I should clarify, the Church of England are not a part of JPIT. The Church of Scotland are an associate partner, which is, for those who are involved, that's a very significant difference. So the way that JPIT works, we represent those different denominations in their shared concern around issues of peace and justice, seek to resource churches and members of the churches, but also to take a voice into the public debates around a range of issues. Often we would not be the only voices there. Often we would actually seek to collaborate with much wider groups. So one example this year that's been a particular focus has been our work around poverty in the UK, and with the government developing its child poverty strategy this year. We are celebrating at this point because the budget and then a week later the publication of the child poverty strategy included that very significant announcement about the scrapping of the 2-child limit on benefits. And that's something that churches and indeed other faith groups have been opposed to on moral grounds since it was very first mooted, and have consistently campaigned along with others for the repeal of that measure. You'll know over recent years, child poverty has steadily risen in this country. Now it affects about 3 in 10 children. And faith groups are really aware of that impact, how harmful it is, from all the work that is going on in local communities and the initiatives like food banks and family drop-ins and debt centres and other things like that. So during this year, one of the things that we did was draw together faith leaders from the 6 major faith groups in the UK to speak out together on this on 2 occasions. I think it's pretty unprecedented for that diversity of faith leaders to come together to agree on something, but to call for a bold and ambitious and properly resourced strategy to begin to turn the tide on child poverty in the UK. And that has been announced now. It's a very welcome first step. There's always more that could be done. There's more that we would want to see. But we particularly welcome alongside the scrapping of that 2-child limit on benefits, the way that people with lived direct experience of the issues were central to the shaping of that strategy. And I think that's also a principle and a value that we would want to bring into the debate. So we can celebrate that strategy. We can celebrate the 500,000 children who will be lifted out of poverty as a result over the next 5 years. And we can celebrate the years of campaigning around that's happened.
And on asylum and immigration, you've also been campaigning hard against that, both in policy and the wider issues in society. How have you come together? What has been your key message on that this year?
In the face of ever increasing stricter policies and harsh rhetoric, we have been trying to articulate a consistent voice for human dignity and for compassion and for fairness in that approach. All faith groups would share the support for a managed approach to immigration and to asylum. But recognizing that the people who are caught up most by this debate are individuals, are people in need, often highly vulnerable people. So arguing for all plans to take into account human dignity and care for human beings. We've seen policies announced in the autumn which actually will make it much harder for people to integrate into local communities, make them have to wait much longer before they can have settled status. So I think we're wanting to argue for a culture of hospitality and welcome that celebrates the gifts that people bring when they come to this country.
Thanks very much for being on the call today. And last but not least, Peter Robertson from Christian Aid, a humanitarian journalist, which is an interesting title in itself. And Peter, we have turned to you several times in the course of the year for your knowledge and expertise on the work of Christian Aid in various countries around the world, in conflict zones. And the list here that I have is Ukraine, Sudan, the DRC, and Gaza. So I don't know which one of those you would like to go first with. Can we perhaps go to Gaza first of all? Tell us something about the work that you do, the extent of the work, and the way that you twin up with other secular organisations as well, in the way that we've just heard Simeon describe for domestic policy. How extensive is the work of Christian Aid in these areas of the world?
Well, we work all over the world. So we have a partnership model. So we're not like Oxfam or the International Red Cross. We work with local partners because they best understand the needs of their local communities. So we, to use our phrase, convene and a catalyst and connect people. So we are often the instigator of things, but we work through those local partners, whether they be in Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, and other parts of the world, including DRC.
What has been your most challenging task this year, would you say?
I think probably for Christian Aid, it has been Gaza, in the sense that it is, from my perspective, the story that the media is most interested in. Obviously, other things bubble up from time to time, partly because of the contentious debate within the UK and its ramifications elsewhere, and also because Western journalists were not allowed into Gaza. So often the media was turning to NGOs like ourselves to get information from people who are there on the ground.
And your work in the DRC, last year when we did the review of the year, we reported on a big visit that had been undertaken by the Archbishop and various leaders of other churches to the DRC. And it's gone quiet this year. Perhaps you can enlighten us. How effective has the church been in its negotiations for peace in the DRC?
Well, I think there's a lot of perhaps unhighlighted work that goes on because the church and churches still have a significant impact on local people. And obviously after decades of conflict and intercommunal violence, it's only really at that really local level that we see some small improvements. The big headline is Donald Trump's brokered peace deal between Rwanda and DRC. Like many of the other peace deals that he has negotiated, is more of a business deal than him acting out of a moral responsibility or showing American leadership. But credit where it's due, he's leveraged Americans' economic and hard power to perhaps break through things that were resistant before. So that is a glimmer of hope. How far it'll actually make the people who in Rwanda actually decide to pull back. What is their incentive to continue with some kind of peace deal? As far as we can tell, the violence continues and the suffering continues. And it will take decades to move beyond perhaps this very small point. So I'm sure we'll be talking about DRC if we do this next year.
Final question for you is that yesterday the head of MI6 made a speech and suggested that we were living in a pre-war state. And I'm wondering how the turmoil in the world at the moment affects the work of agencies such as yours, both in the number of people that come forward to work in these dangerous places and the likelihood of your success in aid that you offer.
It's true to say that probably has never been more needed than what's going on in the world today. But we've also had to deal with the reality of a cut in UK aid funding and a cut in American aid funding. So that has hampered our ability to respond. Luckily, because we're a faith-based organization, most of our income comes from individual donors, churches, and other organizations. So we've not been as badly hit as others. I think we're entering definitely into a more dangerous world. And NGOs, a bit like journalists, are now seen as fair game in terms of being targeted, either politically or sometimes even by violence. So it has become a very difficult and challenging situation to work in these sort of countries.
Well, thank you for joining us and for ending our review of 2025. I'd like to thank all of the people who gave up their time to take part. We will be looking ahead to 2026 in January. Perhaps you'd like to join us again. We'll be in touch, but it's been great working with you this year, and thank you very much for your time.